This is an episode that I already know is going to be controversial, and I know why. Former LAPD Detective Russell Poole stirs emotions in some people because he proposed a theory for Biggie's murder that a lot of folks believe in. And he's no longer living. He's not here to defend himself. I get that. So I'm going to approach this as respectfully as possible. But the full story of how and why Russell Poole left the LAPD has never been told. And the version of events that has been widely spread, that he was forced out or resigned in disgust because he accused dirty cops of killing rapper Biggie Smalls, is apparently a myth. And I can prove it because this is Russell Poole's resignation letter from the LAPD. And it's just the tip of the iceberg for the documents that I have surrounding his resignation from the Los Angeles Police Department. Most or all of which have never been released to the public before. And by the end of this episode, you're gonna know why. Because guess what case is barely mentioned in these documents? I actually have sympathy for Russell Poole and what he put himself through. But the story that has been built up around him, that his resignation from the LAPD was all about the Biggie case, is at best an exaggeration. And even if you don't agree with my conclusions here, I still think it's important that we all see these documents related to his resignation to get a more complete picture of what happened. So first, let's rewind. In October of 1996, Russell Poole is assigned to the LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division, also referred to as RHD, where he's a Detective 1, which is the lowest detective rank. But RHD is the so-called elite division of the LAPD, so it's a big deal for Poole to get into that division. And they team Russell Poole up with a detective named Fred Miller, who is a Detective 3, which is the highest detective rank. So in this case, the LAPD has taken a junior detective, Russell Poole, and partnered him up with a senior detective, Fred Miller, who has 17 years of experience as a homicide detective. But the same month that Poole starts working at RHD, his 36-year-old brother, Gary, goes missing. Supposedly, he just walked out of his house one day, left behind all of his belongings, and I think they found his truck abandoned somewhere, and he just disappeared without a trace. After the disappearance of his brother in October of 1996, the year 1997 starts out busy for Russell Poole and his partner. Some really high-profile cases. In January of 97, he works the murder case of Bill Cosby's son, Ennis, who was killed on the side of the road in LA's Sepulveda Pass. The following month, there is the famous North Hollywood shootout, where two heavily armed men in heavy body armor robbed a Bank of America in North Hollywood and started an insane shootout with police outside the bank that lasts 44 minutes, injures a dozen officers and 8 civilians, and ends in the deaths of both robbers. Poole is the evidence coordinator on the team investigating that high-profile case. On March 18, 1997, 6 months into Poole's time at RHD, LAPD officer Kevin Gaines is shot and killed by fellow officer Frank Liga, and this is a story that I've covered in a previous episode. Poole and Miller catch that case, and this is just 9 days after the murder of Biggie Smalls, which at this point is not their case yet. Poole and Miller ultimately file their report clearing Liga of any wrongdoing in the shooting of Gaines, ruling it self-defense. And by this point, RHD has already taken over the Biggie murder case, and Poole and Miller have been assigned to it. 3 months into their investigation, in July of 1997, an informant named Michael Psycho Mike Robinson tells one of the Biggie murder detectives that he knows who killed Big. But after his first interview with that detective, his claims are dismissed because he was in jail at the time of the murder. He doesn't know anything about the murder itself, where it took place, how it happened.
Let me ask you this, do you know where Biggie was killed?
No, I don't read, none of that type of stuff. No.
What caliber gun?
I heard a machine gun. Could have been a Uzi or a Tech 9, I don't know.
How did the guy get away? Did you ever hear anything about that?
He ran around the corner and got in a limo or a truck or something, drove off.
None of that basic information about the crime is true, and he gives them a bunch of first names with no last names.
Tell me what you know about the Biggie case.
The dude name is Abraham. I can't say his name. It's Arab name.
Okay, who's the dude? Who are you talking about?
His name. I told you his name yesterday. I can't. I don't read right, so.
Okay, so this is the man you're describing here.
Yes.
Is the killer.
Yes.
Okay, you know him as Abraham?
Abraham, or I told you the name yesterday. The name Arab name.
Okay, you told me yesterday the name of Amir.
Amir.
Amir?
Yeah. Amir or Amir. It's an Arab name.
And he claims the killer is a Southside Crip from Compton, which is a reference to a completely different theory at the time that the Southside Crips killed Biggie over an unpaid debt.
So at one point he was associated with either the Southsiders.
Yeah.
But one of the 5 first names Robinson gave for this Southside Crip killer is Amir, which is also one of the most common names in the world. And 5 months later, in December of 1997, former LAPD officer David Mack is sitting in jail for bank robbery when he's visited by an old friend from college whose Muslim name is Amir Muhammad. And I've already done 2 episodes on Michael Robinson that you can check out in more detail. But what's important here is that he claimed to have known this Amir person for a decade or more. And yet he can't remember the guy's name because he couldn't write it down. And when asked to identify Amir's photo, he circled half the photos in the photo 6-pack, including Amir Muhammad's, but years later admitted he just circled half of them, hoping to get a lucky guess. And even though nothing about Amir Muhammad's background as a college-educated mortgage broker matches the description given by Michael Robinson of a Southside Crip bodyguard who rolls around Compton in a white limousine as being the killer, Russell Poole still concludes that Amir Muhammad may be Biggie's killer and that Mack was in on it. And this is really where the myth around Poole begins. In June of 1998, Poole leaves the Biggie investigation and is loaned out to the Rampart task force, looking into the cases that would become the Rampart scandal, one of the biggest scandals in the history of the LAPD. And far from being upset about being taken off the Biggie case, Poole will tell his commanding officer later that he was actually relieved to be assigned to the Rampart case. But then, according to an investigation after his resignation, just 4 months after joining the Rampart task force, Poole begins an extended leave of absence, which he tells his commanding officer is due to emotional distress caused by marital issues and the disappearance of his brother. He ends up being away from his job from October 15th, 1998 to January 8th, 1999. That's nearly 3 months. In the middle of this extended sick leave, in December of 1998, Poole is disciplined for an incident where he was pulled over by police after leaving a party at the police academy. And they discover he's letting a civilian employee of the department, described as his girlfriend, drive his police vehicle for him on a freeway nearby, possibly because he's had too much to drink. And while it was responsible for him to have a designated driver, it was still misconduct to allow a civilian to drive a city vehicle, and Poole is suspended for 5 days, which angers him, and he ends up taking even more time off as a result. During these months that he's away, there are concerns within the department that Russell Poole is suicidal over his marriage and this affair that he's allegedly having with the civilian employee of the LAPD who was driving the night that they were pulled over, and the department sends Poole to therapy and possibly takes his gun away. The following month, apparently finally ready to come back to work, Poole is transferred to the Harbor Division of the LAPD, and reportedly, he is miserable there as well. He's spiraling personally and professionally. On October 25th, 1999, 10 months after coming back to work, and nearly a year and a half after leaving the Biggie murder investigation, Poole submits his resignation to his lieutenant at Harbor Division, effective immediately. And keep in mind, this is barely a year before he'll qualify to get his pension. He's throwing away nearly 2 decades of work and walking away from his pension. And to me, that is further evidence of the state of mind that he was in at the time, the psychological state he was in. So in his resignation letter, after stating that he's leaving because of events in his personal and professional lives, including the unsolved disappearance of his brother 3 years prior, he then mentions his displeasure with the way some investigations he was involved in were handled, and that he's lost his self-confidence and can't move on. He never mentions the Biggie case in this letter, or lists what these other investigations he disapproved of were about. That same day, Poole's lieutenant responds to his resignation. He mentions that he and Poole have had prior conversations and that he wishes there was some way we could have created a work environment that would have relieved some of the stress he were feeling. And he also urges Russell Poole to contact a lieutenant in internal affairs to discuss his concerns with how some cases at RHD were handled. But what were these cases at RHD that concerned Russell Poole? Well, we have an LAPD report on Poole's resignation, this fact sheet, submitted a month later by a lieutenant with the LAPD's Detective Services Group that tells us. The week after Poole resigned, he was contacted by this group, but ultimately declined to meet with them, claiming someone at the chief's office that Poole refused to identify advised him not to meet with them. However, he does tell this lieutenant his reasons for leaving. And here we go. This will be about the Biggie case, right? It's the whole reason he supposedly resigned, right? Well, no, that isn't what he says. He claims vaguely that there were some cases where he felt leads and suspects were not pursued, and that his partner Fred Miller would golf while on duty and Poole would cover for him, and that he felt his 5-day suspension in 1998 for allowing his so-called girlfriend to drive his police vehicle was unfair, and that he observed ethical problems with the Rampart task force when he was assigned to it after getting pulled off of the Biggie case. And he claims the months he took off in 1998 were, quote, due to the emotional distress caused by marital problems and the disappearance of his brother. So again, Poole himself is saying his primary reasons for leaving are due more to personal issues, and it seems that maybe it's secondarily due to some investigations at the department. And then this part is especially interesting. During this time period, Poole first mentioned his desire to resign. But far from being pushed out, as the myth around him goes, he was actually dissuaded from resigning by his commanding officer at RHD. There were apparently multiple conversations where Poole's commanding officer dissuaded him from resigning. So what about those cases that Poole thought were mishandled? There are 4 cases from his time at RHD that Russell Poole cites in other documents as the ones that he had issues with. One of them was the investigation of a former police officer for allegedly beating up a handcuffed gang member. Another case was the Carol Little case, which was about the 1994 murders of 2 fashion executives and a contractor. And it should be noted that by the time Poole resigned, one of those murders had already been solved, with an alleged hitman sentenced to 29 years for the murder of the contractor. The third case was the murder of Tamu Bess, a political organizer and film production assistant who was killed in a botched robbery in 1991. That one was just a random murder with very little to work with, and I think Bess's murder was never solved. However, Poole's lieutenant denied his claim that Poole had expressed concerns to him about the handling of the Cara Little and Tamu Bess cases. And then finally, the 4th case that Poole mentions was the Biggie Smalls murder investigation. And this one sentence in an internal affairs document on Poole's accusations against the department is the only mention of Biggie's case that I can find in any of these documents related to his resignation. Russell Poole resigned from the LAPD on October 25th, 1999. Just 6 weeks later, the Los Angeles Times ran an article pushing his Biggie murder theory that dirty cops were behind it, and naming former LAPD officer David Mack as a suspect, and claiming that Amir Muhammad was, quote, the man they suspect of being the gunman. The headline itself is completely untrue. Not only was David Mack not an official suspect in Biggie's murder at the time, he and Amir Muhammad never had been. In the case of Muhammad, having the same first name as someone a jailhouse informant said was the killer doesn't automatically make you a suspect. And even the LA Times article, near the end, noted the obvious fatal flaw in using Michael Robinson's statement to pursue Muhammad, noting that the informant we know as Robinson stated that the killer is a former member of the Southside Crips street gang, and that information does not appear to match Muhammad's background and could in fact lend support to the theory that the killing was the result of a dispute over money with the Crips, which at the time was an actual theory that the LAPD had pursued, unlike Muhammad. Poole's name isn't mentioned in this LA Times article, but he admitted later that he had contacted the Times just 2 days after resigning and was their source. 5 months later, the LA Times runs a new article by Pulitzer winner Chuck Phillips claiming Amir Muhammad is not considered a suspect. This is the article where Muhammad tells them, "I'm not a murderer, I'm a mortgage broker." And an article in the LA edition of the New Times a month later claims that this controversy and a follow-up article by an outlet called Brill's Content had a devastating effect on the newsroom at the LA Times, calling the article that linked Muhammad to the Biggie case every newspaper editor's nightmare. That original LA Times article had claimed that reporters and police had been unable to track down Muhammad. However, Phillips's article claims he'd found Muhammad in just 3 weeks, and had even conducted several interviews with him. But the truth was even more damning. It had actually taken Phillips just 3 days to find Muhammad, and accusations were made that Phillips's article and Muhammad's quotes in it had been watered down to save the newspaper some embarrassment. And Phillips's editor ended up resigning from the newspaper. I could go on with this, but the most important part of the New Times article to me is that they contacted Russell Poole themselves, and he seems to have backpedaled on his claims here, telling them he made it clear to the Times writers that he hadn't been able to check out the theory, his own theory, in any detail. He tells them, quote, "I'm not saying this guy is the suspect, but here's all the circumstantial evidence." Poole, of course, spent the rest of his life absolutely saying that this guy was a suspect. As the New Times writes, so the Times plastered Muhammad's face and name on the front page on the strength of the undeveloped theories of a disgruntled former cop. And while Muhammad's photo wasn't technically on the front page, it was on a later page in the article. That is essentially what they did. Muhammad and Mac weren't the LAPD's suspects. They were Russell Poole's suspects for a theory that he developed that, by his own admission, even he had barely investigated before the Times published it for the whole world to see. Russell Poole went on to also develop theories on Tupac's murder, even though he never investigated that case as a detective, first blaming it on Suge Knight and later blaming Suge's estranged wife and the former head of security for Death Row Records. Both of those theories, we now know, were false. Russell Poole died of a heart attack in 2015, but it seems his Biggie theory will continue to live on because it's captured the public's attention, and possibly also because there's a lawsuit worth hundreds of millions of dollars based on that theory that could be refiled at any time.